Hello, my name is Dr. Heather Brown, and I would like to thank you for coming to this presentation on gender, weight, and learning, understanding challenges and supporting students, which was presented by the St. Cloud State University Women's Center, of whom I am the new director. So, just a little bit about me. I've actually been working in this space, looking at the connections between weight and learning since about 2009. And the most important thing to understand is that I ground my work in this sense that I truly believe we all deserve the chance to succeed or fail in our learning pursuits without having to face barriers, especially artificial barriers to access and opportunity. We all deserve the chance to succeed or fail on our own without having to face things that other people don't have to face. And to get started, I want to talk a little bit about language usage in this particular presentation. I am going to be using language that's grounded in fat studies. And fat studies is an interdisciplinary field of scholarship that looks at matters of weight from a social and cultural context instead of looking at it as a medical context. So, weight becomes a descriptive category as opposed to an inherently undesirable and diseased state. It's not medicalized. And we argue that the lived experiences of people who exist in fat bodies actually needs to be placed at the center of both the research method and the analysis of the data. Fat studies also believes that terms like overweight and obese are political and medicalized, and we tend to use the term fat as a neutral descriptor, although that is somewhat complicated. And I want to acknowledge that there are people who are not ready to understand fat as a neutral descriptor. And there's a whole body of scholarship that talks about coming out as fat and whether or not people are ready to do that. So I understand that there may be some uncomfortableness as we discuss here, but please note that as I use the language, it truly is used as a neutral descriptor. It's also really important for us to understand definitions as we talk about this work, and it's actually a really complicated part of the research because the definitions are not always firmly decided and they tend to migrate a little bit. Academic achievement and academic outcomes are both often used in the literature and they're used interchangeably and can include anything from the grades that students earn in classes to test scores to whether or not they enter into or complete a post-secondary education, and may also sometimes include whether or not the learner has a sense that they are capable of going into post-secondary education and graduating, in a sense that if they question that capability, they might not actually achieve good academic outcomes. And so that's just a little overarching sense of what it is that we're going to be talking about. So in this particular presentation, I'm going to focus on what the research has to say about the connections between weight, gender, and academic outcomes. I will not be focusing very closely on the impacts of bias and discrimination because that's its own pretty extensive body of research. There's certainly some overlap with what I'm looking on, but in the research that specifically looks at the impact of bias and discrimination, it's a slightly different focus. And then most importantly, I'm actually going to describe what fat women learners themselves say about how their learning institutions can help improve their learning experiences. So we can say that there have been more than 50 years of research around the issues on the connections between weight and academic achievement. But that actual amount of research has been kind of sporadic. So the first articles I saw were in the 1960s, and then there was like a gap of 20 years, and then there was another little spattering of research, and then a big gap. And most of the research during the last 20 years has really focused on the effects of bias and discrimination in the learning experience. So, what the early research says, well, what the research overall says, is that there is a positive or neutral correlation between fatness and academic achievement for male identified learners. But for female identified learners, there's a negative correlation between fatness and academic achievement. And of course, there is an asterisk next to the concept of gender because gender is not complexified at all in the research. It's very either self reported or it's driven in biological essentialism. And so please understand that this is an aspect of the research that really hasn't been focused on very much yet. And so keep that in mind as you think about what the research is telling us. So when we look at secondary school or high school for the research about that, overall what we find is that fat girls are 2 times as likely to think of themselves as poor students. They're more likely to be held back a grade. They have significantly lower GPAs, and they are less likely to want to go to college or attend college if they have a desire to do so. And the challenges maintain into post-secondary education. When you look at college women learners, they're less likely to have their parents' financial support. Parents will pay for their fat sons to go to college, but they will not provide financial support for their fat daughters. Nearly half of fat women believe that they are not capable of graduating from college, and overall, they're less likely to earn college degrees than students who have other demographic backgrounds. So, when we look at the very early literature, there were 3 main areas of focus that we saw. And first is that there's an attendance gap. And here the studies found that fat people, especially women, were not going on to college even though they said they wanted to attend. And then there is an acceptance gap. So even if fat learners really wanted to go on to college, they were less likely to be accepted to attend. And then there was the attainment gap, which is that fat individuals, when they finally get to college, overall had less years of schooling, either didn't finish or just in general did not go on for further education. So when you look at the early literature, there are actually a lot of limitations in these studies. And they were mostly focused on white suburban students who were either planning or hoping to go to elite colleges. It was very focused on the American, British, and Australian learning environments. And there were actually only 7 studies over a 40-year time span. So there was not a lot of attention paid to this. There was a little bit, but not a lot. But there was some really good stuff in the literature as well. There was very little judgment about the capacity of fat people to learn and to be good students. There was just a lot of curiosity as to what is going on here. There was no assumption that fat people either could not learn or go to college, or that they wouldn't want to go to college. So there was just a lot of questioning about what was going on. And the focus was really on systemic barriers to attainment and achievement, not individual barriers to attainment and achievement. So then we hit what is known as the war on obesity, about around the mid 1990s. And what we saw there was a shift of the focus of researchers who were looking at the connections between gender, weight, and learning from systemic barriers to success to a focus on individual ability and effort, and also to whether or not fatness itself caused lower academic achievement or whether a lack of intellectual ability caused fatness. So the question is, are you fat because you're not intelligent, or is something else going on? Like, have you become unintelligent because of your weight? And I want to just give a content note here that I'm going to give some examples from the research, and some of it is really painful and it's really hurtful. And so, I want you to be prepared to know that this is what's out there, and this is what academic researchers are saying about fat learners. So our research suggests that girls who are defined as obese at ages 7, 11, and 16 perform poorly on math and reading tests because, quote, being fat affects your ability to learn and take tests. And while both fat girls and fat boys have this worry that they're poor learners in high school, only fat girls experience significant increases in being held back a grade. Other research suggests that fat high school girls are 40% more likely than any other group to not want to pursue post secondary education, and that they believe that they cannot complete a college degree. Research suggests that fat high school girls earn lower high school GPAs, and I put earn in scare quotes there because the question is do they really earn lower high school GPAs, or are they facing bias and discrimination from the people who are grading them? Other research suggests that fat high school girls are likely to have delayed high school graduations. Basically, that it takes them much longer to complete high school because, quote, the least disciplined individuals are most likely to become obese and to achieve less in school. And this particular research comes out of a line of research that actually argues that because fat women earn much less money than any other group once they get into the workforce, and because they also are less likely to attain post secondary education and degrees, that we should actually, as a culture, as a civilization, stop educating them, usually after middle school, because they are, in essence, a poor return on investment. They will never be able to provide as much in taxes as they do, as other groups do. Just because they're not making as much money in wages, and so they're not paying as much taxes. And so the argument is that we're spending much more in tax money on their education than we can ever get back. I find this a personally abhorrent line of research, but it is out there and is fairly prevalent, particularly in economic analysis. And then I have this lovely quote from Dr. Jeffrey Miller, who is a professor at the University of New Mexico, who basically tweeted out once, Dear obese PhD applicants, if you didn't have the willpower to stop eating carbs, you won't have the willpower to do a dissertation. Hashtag truth. And if you ever want to go out onto the internet, there is a wonderful response to him called Fuck Yeah PhDs. And you can see page after page of fat people with advanced education, obviously with enough willpower to complete a dissertation. Um, this is one of my personal favorite researches, research that I've seen. It's by a researcher named Yamashita, and he postulated that fat American college students eat a lot of cheeseburgers, and therefore they ought to have lower GPAs than Japanese students who also eat a lot of cheeseburgers but do not tend to be as fat as their American counterparts. And his research was actually shown, his hypothesis was shown to be incorrect. It was not the fact that there was a correlation between weight and cheeseburgers and GPA based on nationality, but the researcher actually suggested that there should be mandatory weight loss programs in higher education environments for fat American learners anyway. So when we look at the recent literature, when we sort of look at what's good and what's not so good about it, there are actually a lot of limitations. First off, entire avenues of analysis related to race and ethnicity are often ignored. You end up getting if you get any sort of demographic breakdown and analysis of people and how they're performing, you might get gender, but you will rarely get anything focusing on race or ethnic background, socioeconomic status, generational status, any of that. It's really gender and the size of the body. There's also a lot of lack of common definitions. So people are talking about all sorts of different things that could just get lumped under academic outcomes or achievement. And there's also a lot of limited sources for the data analysis. Almost all the studies are quantitative in nature. They don't have any qualitative integration in the analysis at all. They tend to use really large survey databases that tend to be, there's one that's called Adolescent Health that gets used quite a lot, or Ad Health. And so there's a lot of question about how does this information get collected, who's reporting it, is it accurate, and also with large scale databases, garbage in, garbage out. The analysis of that kind of information is really only as good as the information that's going in. And the information that's going in is determined a lot by the people who are actually might even have some implicit bias in how they're collecting that kind of information. As mentioned earlier, there's very simplified concepts of gender. And overall, there's just a lack of richness to the analysis. Um, the most problematic parts of the research, though, is that it very much has become this self-contained set of analyses that is pretty much grounded in confirmation bias. Almost every single piece of research will start off with a few paragraphs about, oh my God, in whichever country we're looking at, Australia, Britain, Canada, America, there's an obesity crisis, and this is horrible and terrible, and everyone's dying. And then they'll do their data analysis and their findings, and then they'll end with, oh my God, there's an obesity situation here. It's terrible. It's also making people not smart. They're not doing well in school. So we have to end obesity in order for people to be smart. It's so basically the research has become this self-contained system, and it uncritically perpetuates the idea that fat learners, especially fat female learners, will not and cannot be academically successful. And there's actually a lot of problems with the findings and discussions around this information because it is set in this system, in that sometimes the data may not say exactly what they're saying. And I actually have a pretty significant analysis of this. It's actually in my dissertation if you want to look it up. It's about 55 pages long, so it takes a long time. But there are a lot of cases where the data is not actually saying what the authors are saying that it's saying. So you've got to kind of read it with this critical lens to sort of think about what's really going on here. So, as a result of all this research, what we end up finding is that poor academic achievement by fat learners is presented in the research as a medical problem that requires a medical solution. So, we must find a way to make fat people not be fat anymore if we are going to have equity in academic achievement with this population, or the fat learner is presented as an economic problem or a bad investment for which the solution is disinvestment in their education. And there's actually quite a few policy papers out there that have really argued or even just flat out stated that because of this research, because there is this negative correlation between fatness and lowered academic achievement, and this is, of course, the research that doesn't look at bias and discrimination. So it's kind of ignoring bias and discrimination as possible barriers to achievement. They basically argue that we must implement anti-obesity policies and programs on post-secondary institutions, despite the fact that right now there really isn't any data that suggests such policies and programs are actually effective in either promoting long-term weight loss or improving academic outcomes. It's basically like, we know it's a problem, we argue that it's a problem, so we have to find a solution, and the only solution is to make people not be fat, but we don't really know how to do that yet. We certainly don't know if it will change academic outcomes quickly or even in the long term. So, coming at this from a slightly different perspective, and this is where sort of the fat studies framework comes in. If you believe that fat girls and women deserve to pursue an education to the best of their ability in the bodies in which they currently exist, you need to look at the data with a slightly different mindset and a slightly critical eye to really think about, what is it saying that isn't fat people must stop being fat. So you look at the research from a critical lens. We know that if women are heavy, they are more penalized and discouraged than women who are not. So fat girls face more bias, discrimination, and stigma than women who are not heavy face. Although we all, as women in this society, face a lot of pressure about our looks, it's just that fat girls face more of a penalty and face a slightly different form of oppression about the body within the society. The other thing that we see is that there's kind of a vicious cycle going on here, in that peers and teachers often react negatively to fat learners. They may have implicit bias, they may have explicit bias, but fat learners pick up on that. And, they can internalize their own fat phobia, and they start to believe themselves to be unworthy, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So no one else has faith in you. You start not having faith in yourself, and it keeps going and going and going, until you're just really struggling with everything. The third thing is that there's a not so hidden curriculum on campus, and we often talk about the hidden curriculum as sort of these things we don't see, but that teach us how we belong and if we belong within a particular environment. So all the context in how we exist within an educational environment. So for fat women learners, it's actually not so hidden. So they are told in no uncertain terms that they do not belong and are not wanted. And this is all based on very visible things like performance expectations, how desks are structured, where people can sit to take their classwork, whether or not there is programming and advertising on campus that is focused on weight loss first, as opposed to like a health at every size program, how food is served in a cafeteria, and what their experiences are like in athletic and recreational facilities. So this is where we get to where my own research focuses. I really wanted to. I had read all the research and looked at the connections between weight and learning using, the quantitative report approach, and I really wanted to understand from learners themselves, um, what is it that they understood their learning experiences to be like, and what did they want others to know about what could really work for them. And so I didn't want to determine what problems were, but I wanted to find out what those practices and policies fat women really felt could make a difference in their learning experience. So the first thing that the women in my research really wanted people to understand and to do was to stop making assumptions about their abilities based on their physical appearance. So fat women learners are often called lazy, unmotivated, undisciplined. They're overextended. They're all depressed and have mental health issues. And the women in my research really said, this is not an us problem. This is a universal problem. These are universal barriers. College students in general are really struggling with mental health issues. We are working. We're very overextended. Everybody gets lazy and doesn't have discipline or motivation sometimes. And they really wanted people to understand that just because they were existing in fat bodies didn't mean that they were stupid. This is something a lot of them really felt called out for in classes, and really wanted people to just stop doing that. A second thing that was very important in talking with the young women in my study was that family support from a young age was really critical to their sense of themselves as a capable learner. And a lot of the people in my research felt like they had gotten a lot of general encouragement and support from their families. Um, they were all encouraged to think about college as an option. Some of them weren't given a choice. They were told, yes, you are going to college. Overall, they were told they could perceive their dreams and go after them. But they also got a ton of fat talk, particularly from their mothers, or pressure to diet. And over time, they started to feel like just because they were fat, they were somehow defective or less capable because of the body in which they lived. They couldn't make the changes to their body that their mothers, in particular, wanted them to make. And so they really started having that vicious cycle. Where they started to really have poor self esteem and self image, and it started to affect their academic performance. And, one of the things that really became clear is that for many fat women in particular, where there is that fat talk environment, particularly with their mothers, the family becomes a threatening environment. It becomes not a safe place for them. And so now that they got to be college students, they're still struggling with feeling like they're just not quite good enough to succeed. And so colleges and universities can really work on ensuring that the university becomes that nurturing home like environment for all students, regardless of their body size. A third thing that's really important to understand is that fat women learners are extremely body conscious within their learning environments to the point that it may actually interfere with their class participation. In particular, many of the young women that I did research with felt like they had to perform a certain type of femininity in their appearance. They had to be perfectly made up. They had to have perfect hair. They had to have just the right type of clothes. And if they didn't have this, they were very anxious that they would be perceived negatively. So, because they were existing in fat bodies, they had to present a very certain type of feminine appearance just to be treated like their peers who weren't in fat bodies. And the physical environment itself really does tell them that they do not belong. Desk and chairs are raised often as an actual problem, not only causing physical pain, but not allowing the student to fit in at all because they can't slide themselves into the desks. And so they have lots of like really extreme reactions to moving in classroom spaces for fears that they might be out of bounds. And a good way to think of this is if you get into a classroom, um, first off problem, desks that are solid state where the tabletop and the chair are connected by an unmovable metal bar, those are really problematic. Um, Equally problematic are are chairs with arms, especially if they are narrow or cannot be moved. But there's also problems with even if there is like a single state desk or a single desk that can be used. I'm going to show that in the next slide. But the other thing to look at is how is the space structured? So how close are the desks together? How close is the seating environment to the walls of the room? Can people move through carefully without feeling like they need to contort or move their bodies in ways so they don't touch people as they go in and out of the classroom? So basically, I would argue that, as we make changes to classroom space, as we renovate classrooms, we really need to make changes toward universal design. And care should really be taken to ensure that people with all body shapes and sizes, with abilities and disabilities, are feeling welcomed in the learning space. And this might require facilities planning folks to actually talk to people and find out what it is that would work for them. But it will make all the difference in creating a sense of belonging on campus and also sending the message that everyone belongs here no matter what. And so this particular slide, this is actually this is the chair I did my entire doctoral program in. I went to a school that had, you can see here, these solid state desks. Um, and this particular chair was the only non-connected desk system in the classroom. And, thankfully I could fit in this and this was fine. But honestly, if we had someone who came into the classroom who was in a wheelchair, say, we would have to have negotiations about who was going to sit at this desk and or if we could possibly share it. And that's really problematic and uncomfortable for everybody. So this, having a single, as I would call it, fat chair in a classroom is not a good solution to the overall challenge. Another really important thing that fat women learners want people to understand is that they actually feel extremely isolated on campus. They feel often like they're the only ones. And we know from research that they're not, but trying to find that circle of like body friends is really difficult. But it's really important to try to make this happen for students because in the research, even the very problematic research, the only sort of clear solution to promoting um, positive academic achievement, particularly for fat women learners, is to not feel isolated, is to have that sense of belonging. So, fat girls who are with other fat girls in their high schools um, tend to have really good academic achievement. They tend to go on to college, they tend to be successful. And the same thing would likely happen in post secondary environments. If you have a group of friends who look like you and who live in the same type of bodies, you can share your experiences and support each other. You don't feel so alone. And that's really a really important thing. And then finally, it's really important for both educators and staff members who develop programming to really understand that fat women learners see and hear everything that is body related on campus and are very sort of anxious about it and wonder if it's saying something to them. So, everything from how cafeterias are laid out to the messages and advertisements to how we do in class activities, they hear and think about that from a fat perspective of living within a fat body. And so, some really simple things you can do, think about your language and messaging. Are you putting in unintentional implicit bias and discrimination in your work? Are you focusing on weight loss? Are you focusing on um, the medicalization of a fat body? Um, Faculty members, please don't use body focused in class activities to promote participation. I had a couple students talk to me about a in class lesson where they were learning how to do charts. And so the professor had them weigh in class and then enter their weights to do various different types of charts and graphs. And the students felt that that was incredibly humiliating and painful for them. So please don't do that. Um, Understand that it is both actively difficult and financially difficult for fat women to access clothing. Um, if you do drives on campus for clothing, like clothes closets or coat giveaways, please make sure that you have more options than what straight sized individuals can access. I can't imagine. We had a coat drive here not too long ago, and I can't imagine going to that as someone who wears a 3 or 4X outer garment to go to that. And maybe they would have something, but maybe they wouldn't. But chances are I maybe wouldn't go if I was less confident in my body than I was, because I would be afraid I'd get there and they couldn't provide me with a coat. So I realize it's a challenge, but always try to have a couple of sort of extended sizes in sort of clothes closets or clothes giveaways or anything related that could be influenced by body size. Um, Also, figure out how to create spaces and opportunities for fat women to really engage in joyful movement where they won't be harassed or teased. It was really interesting with my research. Many of the young women I talked to were not necessarily in team sports, but they were active in things like swimming, hiking, and sort of individualized physical movement. And some of them just really liked walking. And so if you can find, ways where people can enjoy their bodies and move their bodies in ways that feel good for them, it will do a tremendous amount to creating a really positive experience of being a student on campus and having the whole experience. And so I just like to say there's some new research that's recently come out, and they have a really great website. And I really recommend that everyone go and take a look at it. There's a lot of photojournalism that's gone into it, and there's also student statements about what they're thinking about the different things that they themselves photographed. It's called fatoncampus.com. Spend some time there. It's really great to look at and a ton of really good information. So I want to thank you for listening to this presentation, and I'm always available for questions. My email address is heather.brown@stcloudstate.edu, and look forward to interacting with you in the future. Thank you.